Welcome to another edition of CWJah Talk. My name is Greg Stafford, and I host this Saturday show for Christian witnesses of Jah, so that we can come together around the earth and discuss the things that we believe, talk about the reasons why we believe them, and help other people to either understand our positions better and or adopt them as well if they believe that our reasons are sufficient for them to accept. But we don't force ourselves on people. We just do what we believe is right, and we give others an opportunity to do the same. So I talked a little bit last weekend about our three things, the three things that we believe and that we put above everything else. So we let people within our group decide for themselves whether they're going to do things like holidays, vote. We try to stay out of people's lives so that you can devote your life to Jah, and we can help you along the way. It's already difficult enough in a world that does not promote worship of Jah or highlight the historicity of Jesus Christ and the things that he did in fulfillment of the law of Moses and the prophets and the Hebrew prophets. And by prophets, I mean people like Isaiah, whose writings we have in excellent quality and in almost two complete copies from the Dead Sea Scrolls, one to 200 or 300 years before Jesus was born. And we have also the royal impression of Isaiah's ring, recently discovered, to show that he was in fact a royal official of the court. That's what we mean by a prophet in the days of Israel. We're not talking about people who claim to be prophets in ways that really don't reflect the biblical idea. So people like Moses and others, those who declared the will of Jah, to lesser or greater degrees, depending on their appointment or the things that they're teaching. You could teach the Bible and be proclaiming the word of Jah. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you've been appointed in the same manner as someone like Moses or others. But we leave each other to stand before Jah and Jesus when it comes to everything but belief in Jah, accepting Jesus, and treating others the way we want to be treated. So I introduced those three things in terms of these videos last week to just give a brief summary so that people know in simple terms who we are. Who are the Christian witnesses of Jah? We're not just another group that has a long list of things that we believe you have to do to qualify or to be associated with us. We try to live our lives as Christians according to the earliest records that we have of Jesus and his earliest followers and those who preceded them and who were a part of the nation of Israel and who were earlier than the formation of the nation of Israel, but who nonetheless worship Jah. By Jah, we don't mean that other ways of referring to God, the biblical God, are incorrect. For example, we understand we speak English, at least where I am, so we anglicize terms like Jesus even, or I mentioned Isaiah earlier. These are not how those biblical terms were spoken, either in Hebrew or Aramaic or in Greek. So we're using terms today in our language that represent how we talk, the way that we speak. And part of what I'm going to discuss today about Jah is evidence that he's the one who not only gave us the ability to speak, but who diversified the languages of humanity not too long ago. It's interesting because when you hear about humanity, anytime almost that you read in secular writings or in so-called scientific literature or literature about the history of humanity, it gets into the realm of evolution and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of years beyond what we have evidence for. And it's not just evolutionists with their timeline in terms of what they believed would have been necessary for all of these things to have occurred, which I disagree could have ever happened, no matter how much time you have in the first place or thereafter. it would not occur. It's not how things come to be living. They either come from something already alive through a process of reproduction, or they don't. Or in some ways, we may be able to do things as intelligent beings to generate compounds that in some way are a part of our life or physical structure. That is not generating life. That is not, and even with all of that intelligence and controlled conditioning of certain experiments, they cannot create conditions that would lead to the evolution of life or the formation of a cell. Very fundamental things that without an explanation that you can test scientifically, the theory is going to stay that. And it's a theory that fails. It doesn't hold up. It doesn't explain how life can only give life to life and therefore be eternal. And that's where we start. We start with our life. I talked about this last week in the 3 things in a summary form. But when we're talking about Jah, we don't start with the Bible. We don't start with the idea that the Bible is true. We go from there. That's the same problem that evolutionists make. They assume that Jah is not there, and then they go forward with the idea of accidental formation over time, and then the rest they fill in as they feel necessary, believe necessary. So with us, we start with life. At least that's what I did. Some of us may have grown up in a household or in a religion where it was part of our lives, and so it's hard to differentiate when we first thought about God apart from our religious training or upbringing. But after I decided that the Watchtower was not the best place for me to raise my family and to continue proclaiming Jah, then I had to go through a period where I had to connect the dots. I had to essentially reconnect with Jah. I had to review everything that brought me to him and into the Watchtower and made me want to recognize him apart from all other gods. So that's what I did, and I realized that life can only come from life, and we're here now. That being the case, life has to be eternal. Louis Pasteur is famous for the argument that life only gives life to life. But he did not draw from that scientific fact that I'm aware of, that must mean, it scientifically has to mean, life is eternal. In other words, it never started. There was never a time when life didn't exist. It couldn't be the case, because if life only comes from existing life, that chain can never break unless somewhere in the chain life comes from something not alive, which is not scientifically provable or demonstrable at all. So once I realized that, and along with all of the other, once I realized that and all of the other conditions, systems, levels of organization and symmetry that we behold on a regular basis, that we are ourselves, from the cell upward to our whole structure, physical form, and beyond that our spirit. But that's not so easily to discern as it is to look at a cell under a microscope and our physical structure and identify the things that mark intelligence. Extreme intelligence beyond anything we can do. And look at what we can do now. And that also ties in with the second thing I'm going to talk about. So when it comes to Jah, there are 4 things I want to talk about today. I should just go ahead and introduce those. And then that way we can start talking more about them. And remember, this is a discussion show. So we're here to just ask questions and talk about the things in a casual manner, fairly loose manner. And then tomorrow I'm going to broadcast a video where I will present what I believe is the best information that I can put in 5 to 10 minutes about Jah. And I'm going to start with the life that gave life to life, but I'm going to move quickly past that because I think we can establish that easy, just like we did, just by talking about it. And then I'm going to deal with 4 things. 4 things from the book of Genesis that I believe establish Jah as the life that gave life to life eternally and the one who did so intelligently. So often the book of Genesis, surprisingly, Genesis is cited by evolutionists and others because they like to think that it doesn't make sense scientifically, when I find it's just the opposite. But there are 4 things I'm going to talk about today. I could talk about a lot. And we'll probably, depending on how long we talk today, get into some of the other things than the 4 I'm going to introduce. But I'm going to focus primarily, especially tomorrow, on the 4 things I'm going to talk about in just a second. And then tomorrow, what I'm going to do with the Great Message broadcast is I'm going to talk. Those broadcasts are meant to be brief, 5 to 10 minutes. So you're going to see me. I'm going to try to mix it up a little bit. And but the main thing is the message. So I'm going to focus on the message. But I'm going to mix it up a little bit. I have some other areas in my house that I can use, and in my outdoor areas. But I'm going to talk for about the opening 45 to 60 seconds. So you'll see my face, and I'll be interacting like I did last week on camera. And then it's going to cut to still shots of pictures of everything I'm talking about. So you're going to see images of areas of the earth that I'm going to refer to involving the flood, evidence showing structures and locations above and below the water that would suggest strongly that the flood is a real event, that the things that the Bible and other books talk about really did happen. And the same thing with other texts. So I'm going to show examples of writing. I'm going to introduce the 4 things in a minute, but basically tomorrow we'll go from the intro into the still shots. Now you still hear my voice. It'll be one continuous flow. I'm not going to break up these things, the messages, and edit them. I don't feel I need to, because I like just talking about it. I think that's the best way to come through and be as I would if I were talking anywhere else. Although, again, we're a little more casual here and in the morning on our day texts than on the Sunday Great Message. So I'm going to give some still shots, and then I'll come back for probably the last minute or so, and then I'll wind it up. And so you'll have, for the bulk of the video, the Great Message videos, I may even go back. The first one was so brief, I don't think I need to go back and still shot that one. But the ones moving forward, they're going to be at least 5 to 10 minutes, probably closer to 10, somewhere in the middle. And then I'm going to have about a minute in the beginning, a minute at the end, where you'll see me and the environment in a live shot. But in the middle, just evidence, just images of things that I believe will accent what I'm talking about, so that you'll have the opportunity to either look those up on your own or see an example. So for example, today I'm going to be talking about 4 things: the Garden of Eden, the flood, the Tower of Babel, and Babylon after the flood and after Nimrod established it, and Sodom and Gomorrah. There are so many things from Genesis I could have picked to show it is a credible historical book involving things that are not just like archaeological finds. Like earlier I talked about the Isaiah imprint, the imprint from his royal signet ring. Okay, so that shows he was a real existing person. We knew that, or we believed it, but it helps establish his historicity. But that doesn't prove necessarily that Jah is the eternal life that gave life to life, right? So, okay, but when it comes to things like Eden, where it doesn't exist on the earth today, the surface of the earth, but the book that is from those who worship Jah, and in fact, the 2nd chapter of that book, which talks about the location of Eden and the rivers that were surrounding and joining near and through it, that's something that is credible beyond our ability to know historically, outside of very special evidence like satellite images that show areas we cannot observe any longer because the surface of the earth has changed since the flood. So to me, proving that Eden, or that details associated with the location, the existence of Eden, is an evidence that Jah is the real existing God, because it is a story many people believe is fiction and that can be proven by evidence that is beyond just a simple find in the dirt. It's a bigger deal when the Bible talks about things that no one would have known unless they were really there, except for the fact that we can see them from space today. So we have an advantage, and we can use it to show the credibility of this account that talks about our history so long ago and that is attributed to the God Jah, Jehovah. We call him Jehovah in English. Jah, we believe, is the least disputed form. And I will talk a little bit more about the divine name as we move forward. But primarily, this isn't a show about the divine name. So I don't mind talking about it or getting questions, but it's a show about Jah. Why do we believe the life that is eternal and that is intelligent, that we can prove scientifically, why do we believe that is Jah? So I believe we can use evidence from the accounts that are historically related to Jah and the things he did and said and those who served him that would be impossible to know unless they were true. One of those is the Garden of Eden. So in the account of the Garden of Eden, it talks about there being 4 rivers, that there was the river ushering out of the Garden of Eden divided into 4 rivers. Today we know 2 of those rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. They're given other names in the actual text, but 2 of them are identified as the Tigris and the Euphrates. The other 2 were not as easily identifiable. And if you look today on a map, you really only see those 2, the Tigris and the Euphrates, very clearly. However, you can also see, and it's been now become accepted as basically that the Karun River is also one of those 4 rivers. And so the question then is, what's the 4th? Well, in 2010, the 4th river was found. It was found, and I'm starting to see questions come in, so that's good. How you doing, David? Nice to see you in there and posting things. It's good now that I can see I have it set up right. This should make it also better for the day texts, whoever decides to join us. And I'll definitely get to those questions and comments. So you can see, if you look online, and tomorrow I'm going to show you, I'm going to include in the still shots in between my intro and closing on the great message about Jah, I'm going to show photos, a couple that show that area, and show you the river that was found, that just like the account in Genesis says, circles the land of Ethiopia, and we believe is known as the Wadi Batan. And you will be able to see it in the satellite photo that was taken in 2010. So to me, that is evidence not only that the world before the flood was much different, but that the things that we read about in Genesis concerning the different world of that time are accurate. Accurate to the point to where we may not be able to see them physically by going there, but we can see the evidence that they were there. And that, to me, reinforces it even more, because it's not like it's something that could be misidentified and maybe this is what they meant. It's something completely gone or transformed in terms of how they describe it in the biblical account in those days, and then what you would see if you traversed the land that it describes today. Without the satellite imagery, it would look like a totally different place. And there are a number of locations in the earth today that are completely different than the way that they are described historically, that I'll also talk about in future episodes. But the Garden of Eden, I believe, is a real location that is now beneath the Persian Gulf. And we have actual historical information. And when I say actual, I mean credible historical information from sources over thousands of periods of years and maintained by peoples over various times and cultures and in numerous languages that represent these things as fact. And then we can use that to show that the things that are attributed to Jah and what he has talked about as having happened long ago are reliable, are accurate. And our faith is best on the best available reasons. And we have that. We have the information that tells us about Eden, where it was, what it was like, and the 4 rivers that issued out from the one river that ran through it. So I believe the Garden of Eden, tomorrow I'll show you some still shots and give you a better brief synopsis in the Great Message to complement those shots. The second of the 4 items from Genesis that I believe establish Jah as the real living God from history is the flood, Genesis chapter 6. The evidence showing the flood is a real event is all over the earth, the entire earth. When it is evaluated in terms of what the Bible says happened, will likely contain some evidence, whether it's shells, a different landscape than what exists today, evidence of a different landscape. So, for example, we have evidence showing that in the area of Egypt, where it is now a desert, was once more lush, more green. And we know that the whole earth was much different in the days when giant creatures existed, like dinosaurs and other creatures. But we can only speculate or use the evidence we have from fossils to a certain extent there. But when we're talking about the flood, we have sunken cities in places where, well, we know the cities weren't built underwater, and we know that the evidence we have for human existence only goes back, really, if we're going to use writing, metallurgy, and real civilization, 5,000 to 8,000 years. I can't account for any more than that. And for me, I really wouldn't even be able to add it up past 6 chronologically. I can see how more time could have been involved, but there are several variables when it comes to the pre-flood world. And that involves the flood, of course. The lengths of lives of these people are said to have been much longer. They were said to have been involved with Nephilim or giants. And we also believe, or at least I do, that the Genesis account speaks of the sons of God descending from heaven and coming to the earth and taking daughters of men. So they would have had not only the advantage of living longer. When we live long today and we're able to develop our skills, our civilization and technology increase, they would have had longer lives, more time to make use of their environment because it wasn't as developed as things are today. They were probably bigger if they were existing with giants and they were working more in the environment. Likely they were bigger than us today. We have wisdom teeth. I believe our wisdom teeth are actually evidence of our bigger selves. They're not evidence that we were prehistoric apes or other type creatures. Otherwise, we would have much different jaws and teeth types versus just a couple extra big teeth at the back for chewing. To me, that indicates a slightly bigger human from which we descended. So everything was bigger before the flood, apparently, if we look at things like insects, dinosaurs, and other creatures. And the humans are said to have lived much longer. So they would have been able to develop techniques and construction methods over the course of much longer lives and in association with people living much longer. And those who brought with them knowledge from earlier generations more directly versus more remotely today. So everything would have been based upon that scale of knowledge and understanding and existence, which changed. We know Jah changed the length of time that we live, and after the flood, things were different. But the fact of the flood, it's a fact. It's not a theory. There are sunken cities that were not built underwater all over the earth. There are sunken cities at the highest navigable bodies of water on the earth. Lake Titicaca, in the Peruvian area of South America. This place has a massive lake, at the bottom of which is a sunken city, and in which are seahorse. So we're dealing with evidence that we can use to show not only that cities once existed before the flood in areas where there's water now, but we have creatures where they're not supposed to be. And here we have the Bible saying that the water covered the top of every single mountaintop. That fits. That fits exactly with what we find at Lake Titicaca. No one can really explain why we even have that lake there. And to me, it seems pretty obvious. The waters of the earth exceeded the tops of every mountain. And then they receded, and Jah flooded that city and destroyed it, just like he flooded and destroyed these other cities, whether it's the Yonaguni monument off of the coast of Japan, or in other areas of the earth where cities exist, underwater or in areas that makes no sense. I'm going to talk more about this later, but I believe actually what we identify as Atlantis is the Richat structure, or the Eye of the Sahara in Africa. If you look at that, and there's another video on YouTube. I'm going to do a separate video. I'm going to link to this guy. He did a really good job. Bright Insight. I haven't seen all of his videos, but he's shown some good images and made some good comparisons. I'm going to actually translate Plato's accounts of Atlantis, and I believe you'll see, if you look that up, the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara, it seems so out of place. And it has the mountain ranges above on the north, which is exactly how Herodotus describes it. It's in the area of northwest Africa, where Herodotus writes the word Atlantis in his map. And it's circular. It has the exact numbers of circular rings. It has a well in the center. It has mountains in the surrounding area on the north where there are rivers that flowed water into the circular bays of Atlantis, just like Herodotus describes. And there's an entrance and exit to the south. And if you look that up, if you look the Richat structure up, which I believe is Atlantis, you will see it. It looks like Jah just smashed a bunch of earth and closed that south entrance shut. So Africa was a totally different place, especially in that area. But after the flood, it does talk about an earthquake in Plato, an earthquake destroying Atlantis. But that could have been an earthquake after the flood, totally, destroying Atlantis, so that it's not even a habitable region today. Whereas before, it was thriving. It was allegedly a place established by the god Poseidon, which could have been a son of Jah, who came down after things went wrong in Eden and took advantage of the conditions of the earth, or at least thought he could, until Jah closed down Atlantis and everything around it. So look at these things carefully. Look at the images, the satellite images. Ask yourself, how could that have happened? Clearly, there's a massive flow of earth right over that south entrance on the Richat structure. What could have done that? I mean, to me, it's water. Water moves earth. Just like I talked about last week with Gobekli Tepe, the place near Mount Ararat, not too far, I believe about 100 miles, where they have uncovered massive pillars that have carvings of creatures on them, all that seem to represent the same types of creatures that were brought on the ark. And if that's not a location where Noah kept the creatures before loading them into the ark, you tell me what that is. It's certainly a place that existed before the flood, because there's no record of it after the flood, and it was buried in sand. This gigantic area was buried in sand. And when you watch videos and stuff on that, certain shows, they talk about the people of the area of Gobekli Tepe burying it as some kind of ritual. Makes no sense. Not only I don't see why they would spend the time and resources to bury a place like that, but what moves sand is very heavy, especially in large quantities, is water. Water moves sand. And Gobekli Tepe was buried in sand before it was recently discovered last couple decades by a shepherd, I believe, who was in the area and noticed a piece of one of the columns sticking out. Look that up. Look up Gobekli Tepe. Now you'll see, the way a lot of people are dating this structure to 10,000, 13,000 BC. They're just throwing out those dates because most of the time I find they're trying to associate the date of these big events, whether it's the flood or certain catastrophic events that caused civilizations and regions of the earth to change. They try to attach that to the Ice Age and what they believe was a time when the earth either released a lot of water or froze a lot of water and created these varying conditions. But that is really speculation. It doesn't really jive with the idea that people would build whole cities, erect entire structures, massive stone columns, with the conditions changing so rapidly. If they saw that the Ice Age conditions and everything taking place around it was happening to that extent, and so many conditions were being affected, it just seems very unlikely to me they would begin building cities, monuments, structures that look like zoo containments out of solid stone, knowing they'd probably have to relocate fairly soon. But in any event, that's not what the records indicate as far as why these things happened. And then they also then are not able to explain extinction events that even most evolutionists say occurred. But yet somehow the extinction wasn't complete and allowed for the re-evolution of all these different species. So Eden, the fact that we can identify the information that's described in Eden in terms of the location of the rivers, the number of the rivers, the flood, the description of the flood from Noah's Ark to the containment of the animals. But those things we kind of associate that with the repopulation of the earth, humans and animals. So that's our explanation versus the extinction events that they explain only by re-evolution. But the real hard evidence you want to look up, and that tomorrow I'm going to still shot into the great message about Jah as part of these 4 Genesis proofs, are the sunken cities, the monuments. They're all over the earth. So I'm not going to spend, unless it's in response to a question, a great deal of time in getting into the details. I've mentioned a few, and I'm going to mention more tomorrow. But I'm sort of setting up any continued discussion. Then I'm going to get to some of your comments. Dave's talking about some writings, and I appreciate that, Dave. Thank you. I am working on a lot of things. I'll explain that in a minute, and why you don't see a lot of published writings necessarily. I am fairly active online. I do put a lot of things on my forum, translations. I don't blog as much as I used to, but I'll explain why, and there are reasons. Mainly time constraints, and then having the right plan. I want to be able to use the information I put out there to effectively reach people. And sometimes I feel like there's already enough information out there that maybe I don't need to write something about some subjects I've already discussed. But I know people like to hear about it anyway. And there is always new information I can include. So, but there are reasons why I'm not as active, and I'll get to that in a moment. And then let me move to the third point. The third point I'm going to highlight tomorrow, and then I'm going to show you still shots of important information. The Tower of Babel, Babylon. Okay, so we know after the flood that it talks about the sons of Noah, and it goes into detail. It describes, first of all, it tells us that after the flood, Noah lived another 350 years. So then you have the sons of Noah that it describes in the different families of the earth that came from them. It talks about Nimrod, who was the first to set himself up in the post-flood world as a mighty one, someone arrogant, someone who took the attention to himself rather than give it to Jah. And of course, Nimrod is really the figure who is behind a lot of these other systems that developed. For example, in Egypt with Osiris, that's all associated with and based on Nimrod. But we'll talk more about that another time. So after the flood, Noah continued to live, his sons. You had Nimrod, and it talks more about Nimrod than some of the other sons in that account, Genesis chapter 10. And it says he then established various cities. He made a start, and his principal kingdom was in Babylon, and how he set up actually a number of kingdoms, including Nineveh, which we recently, last century or so, excavated, and in the land of what is called Shinar. So this whole area and region, as they began to go south from what was then Eastern Anatolia, the Mount Ararat region, down into Sumer, Mesopotamia, Babylon, all these different areas and regions that somewhat overlay each other, and then even further south into Egypt. Whether parts of Egypt existed before the flood, and that's why they returned there, I'm not sure. I do know that the Sphynx unmistakably shows signs of water erosion on its sides. I'm looking into that. I'm going to continue to evaluate it and the different Sphynx legends, but wouldn't surprise me. Wouldn't surprise me if parts of the area in the Giza Plateau are pre-flood, and that's why they went back and built around certain things that they knew about from the sons of Noah, the legends pre-flood that they would have known about. And so when you look at the Sphynx, though, you can clearly see, again, we're talking about a desert, and you have massive erosion on the sides of the Sphynx that would indicate at one time a significant downpour of water hit that structure. So you can look at these places and see, again, the credibility of the accounts in Genesis, not only for the Tower of Babel, which we'll get into further in a minute, but the flood as well. So, and I believe there's even salt water that's been found, a salt residue inside the Great Pyramid. But I'll look into that a little bit more, whether parts of the Giza Plateau are pre-flood or not. It'd be interesting, but there's so much other evidence. It's not necessary to prove, but it's an important region, especially when you look at the migration south from the Mount Ararat region and into Sumeria, Mesopotamia. I mean, those regions, again, overlap to some extent, and you'll find references to them somewhat overlap or refer to the same area. So moving on to the Tower of Babel itself. So here they are now, having migrated into the region of Babel and having Nimrod having established these cities. We know that the account then goes into Genesis chapter 11 and describes how the earth at that time continued to be of one language. So what language? Well, we're not really sure. We do have certain evidence that might indicate either glyphs were used as a means of communicating, or that cuneiform, or an early form of cuneiform, was used. So we have things like the Fuente Magna bowl, which is a bowl that was found in the region of Lake Titicaca in South America, but it has cuneiform. So to what extent that means that the language before the flood was cuneiform-like, and that it was all around the earth, and hence not only in the region of Babylon or Mesopotamia, but also in South America, or whether the flood, maybe the flood even moved the bowl, because Lake Titicaca is there, and there are, I believe there are other significant structures in that region. More likely, the bowl is from that region. So to me, that would indicate that cuneiform was used in South America. But that doesn't mean it was used in South America right after the flood. It could have been used before the flood in places like Lake Titicaca, the city at the bottom of that lake, and in the surrounding areas. Teotihuacan, I believe, is located not too far by. Pumapunku. These are places with structures we can't even figure out today how they were built. They're gigantic, massive. Would have required either humans or giants or both, and probably sons of God unless they had ways of cutting stone we just don't know about, to fashion and erect these structures. But I wouldn't discount humans either, because we lived longer and we were more advanced than evolutionists and others give us credit for. So the Tower of Babel. All right, so we're not going to prove today what was the one language that is being referred to there, but there's some evidence that it was cuneiform. And so that would make sense, right? If the account is talking about how at that time, after the flood, they were all using the same language, and we have evidence before the flood that was cuneiform, or cuneiform-like, and that's the same language that we find all throughout the region under discussion, the land of Shinar, Babylon, Nineveh, then the question is, how did these different languages all develop from cuneiform? Well, linguistically, historically, if you just look at it as in an anthropological sense, non-Jah sense, I don't know how you would be able to develop that many different families of language, all from that one time. So everyone can identify. There's no evidence of written language earlier than 3,500, 4,000 BC. That's amazing. When you think of how long they say we've been around, or would have had to have been around for certain things to occur accidentally over time, and yet we only have evidence of writing from around 4,000 BC, that fits the biblical timeline. That fits the Bible's description of the earth being of one language up until the time of the Tower of Babel in Mesopotamia, when Jah confused the languages. Now, there's two things here to keep in mind that I believe prove Jah, or that Jah is the real existing God from history, the eternal life that gave life to life. We have the languages. We have here in Genesis an explanation for the division of those languages, and we have evidence like the Fuente Magna Bowl in South America and subsequent discoveries of cuneiform in the area we know as Mesopotamia from history that can be explained really, in my view, only by the story in the Bible, or by a story like it that describes the language of the earth as being one and then being diversified relatively recently, right? Or we would have evidence of all these different languages from way back. You wouldn't just have the Fuente Magna Bowl. Or if it was a system of glyphs, again, I'm not going to discount the possibility that places like Gobekli Tepe, or even some of the Egyptian structures and their use of glyphs, some cave paintings even. I don't really know to what extent cave paintings could be accepted as writing. Some people online like to do that because they then throw the cave paintings back 50,000 years or so to Cro-Magnon man. And again, their whole timeline gets just thrown off by evolution and what they believe would be necessary for things to accidentally form over time. Whereas when you just look at history, you get actual evidence that shows you what time things were taking place. And so we can identify cuneiform as one possibility, a strong possibility in my view, especially given the Fuente Magna Bowl's location and finding. I'm open to other views, but to me that's pretty good evidence. So here we have Jah, the biblical record associated with Jah in Genesis, identifying that exact same location in Babylon, Shinar, land of Shinar, Mesopotamia, as where language was confused, where it then spread out throughout the earth. That doesn't mean that cuneiform disappeared. It didn't, right? It doesn't say people all stopped writing and using that language. It just said that the language was diversified, confused. So some stayed there, I'm sure. And because, well, we know that those regions continued to thrive for centuries thereafter. And then other areas of the earth became populated. We had all the islands and places of the earth, like the Bible says, You had places like Greece and other locations develop families of language and writing. The earliest evidence of which are things like Linear B fragments. So our evidence for writing, again, there is no evidence for writing earlier than 3,500, 4,000 BC. And if you're talking about actual writing, I'm not including things like cave paintings, which again, I don't think are as old as some people claim. But if we had this diversified of a language, family of languages, we wouldn't just have a fraction of evidence for one of them as existing before this time in Babylon. We would have evidence of all kinds of languages that developed over the time during which it is alleged that humans evolved. That's not the case. We have exactly what the Bible describes. So that's 3. Excuse me. And the 4th thing, before I get to Dave's question, I'm glad you guys, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. This is for you. This is for me too. I enjoy it. And I'm going to do it even if it's just one other person, because, Jesus is the one who said 2 or 3 are all you need. And to me, all I need is a place to praise Jah. And that's what I'm going to do. The world can listen or not. This is for you and for me and for those who praise Jah. So on the 4th point, and that I'm going to develop further tomorrow, and that I'm going to show pictures of, still shots, Sodom and Gomorrah. I want to encourage every one of you. I'm going to post links to videos tomorrow too. I'm going to post links to videos on the flood, on language, on Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm definitely going to have still shots tomorrow, maybe on Eden too. It's not easy to find videos that are reliable to recommend. It doesn't mean that everything has to be perfect, but I don't want to have to unexplain things in videos that, I trust you will all be able to see what's accurate and not in some of these links. But some of these people, they make a good case on one hand, and then they move into another subject that isn't as convincing. So I try to find things that will be purely convincing or as convincing as possible. Why Sodom and Gomorrah? Because we have evidence they were destroyed exactly like Genesis says. Hard evidence. I'm going to post video. If you haven't already seen it, there is video, and you could go there. It's not an easy location to access. It's essentially nothing grows or lives there, just like it was totally obliterated. And that's because when you go there, you're going to see evidence of sulfur pellets embedded in the structure. And you could look it up, and I'm going to post the best videos I've found of this. It's incredible. There are millions of sulfur pellets embedded, just like they rained down into these huge slabs of ash that were once these mud brick buildings. You can see them. There are even ziggurat formations. They've all been totally consumed in fire, burnt to ash. And it's incredible when you look at the cities and when it talks about Sodom and Gomorrah and the 5 cities surrounding it. It was a busy region. It is desolate. It is totally gone when you look at it now. And so the evidence from Sodom and Gomorrah that you need to know and you need to be prepared to share of the sulfur pellets. Remember, the account says Jah rained fire and brimstone. Sulfur. That's what that means. Sulfur. And it embedded itself into those brick structures and burnt them from the inside out. Totally destroyed them. They even found bone fragments where they melted the bone. The bone got so hot it melted the marrow inside the bone, turned it completely white. And that was the punishment from Jah for what those people chose to do. And so these are not stories. They're not myths. These aren't things, when people think about them today and they're not Christians or believing Jews, then they think of them almost always as a myth, that never happened. And yet Eden, the flood, the diversification, confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel in Mesopotamia, and Sodom and Gomorrah are 4 of the most important stories in the book of Genesis and in our history, we can prove actually occurred. So, and I only scratched the surface. I didn't talk about the evidence for Noah's Ark. I didn't talk about all the other information we have. There's a satellite photo. I'm going to show this tomorrow. I used to, at one time I suspected that the great ziggurat of Ur, and remember Abraham is from Ur. The ziggurat of Ur might have been the Tower of Babel. And we have accounts in history that talk about how part of it was destroyed, and Alexander also came and destroyed part or the rest of it. But I wasn't sure to what extent. If you look at the top of the ziggurat of Ur, it is unfinished or destroyed. So I wasn't quite certain what to make of the historical reference and the condition of that ziggurat. But it appears that another footprint, much bigger, has been found by satellite imagery. So I'm going to show that tomorrow. And that appears to be the true location of what was once the Tower of Babel. One more thing on the Tower of Babel. What did Jah say was the reason he was going to do it? Because if they continue to build this massive structure, look at these ziggurats. These are incredible structures. Then nothing would be impossible for them. Look at us today. We're in space. We're building things far beyond what they were building in those days. Maybe not always as good in some sense, but nonetheless, we're far beyond them in terms of where we can exist. We fly planes, we fly in space. So Jah was right. He knew back in those days that if he let them continue and didn't slow their progress, they would have gotten into space and gone far beyond where he wanted them to be before he could redeem us through his son. Everything in those accounts is accurate, from the things Jah says would happen to the things Jah said did happen, and everything else that I mentioned from Eden to Sodom and Gomorrah. So those four things are what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. Dave wanted to know about more publications. The first thing I'm planning, and if Jah willing, it will take place, is a translation of the book of Proverbs. I've been working on that for several years. It's taken a lot of my time, a lot of my concentration, but it's worth it. And I do that behind the scenes because I want to do a credible job. I want to do the best representation of those texts I can, and give people both the Hebrew and Greek so they can look at the information, use it. I think it's fascinating, tremendously beneficial. I'm going to explain the history of Proverbs. You know, oftentimes you hear criticism. The people will say, well, a lot of those Proverbs aren't original. You know, those are just Proverbs from earlier cultures. We'll talk about whether or not that's true. I'm gonna explain that in the book and deal with certain examples. But even if it was, so what? They're not said to be brand new sayings. They're not all the sayings of Solomon. Why would we think that knowledge and wisdom would have changed or not been available in these proverbial forms in earlier cultures and simply been passed along through those who retained it and who eventually worshiped Jah? So the criticism is not only probably not correct in most cases. That is, that there's this batch of Proverbs that all match what we read in the biblical texts. But even if it were the case, it doesn't make them less useful or incorrect in any way. And so why would we think that they wouldn't be preserved just because an earlier culture used them and also saw they were beneficial in that way, or that Jah wouldn't have given them to earlier persons, from Abel to Enoch to Abraham to others. That knowledge was available. When you look at accounts and people like Job, even he in the Far East had heard and learned of Jah. So these things were very well known. And if you remember in the book of Acts how the Ethiopian was one who was witnessed to. Even in the first century, we had people, Ethiopian Christians. And what was the Ethiopian doing? He was reading from the Hebrew texts. So they had copies of the texts. the texts of the Bible, the texts related to the history of humankind and to Jah and those who served him, are very reliable, textually and historically. So we identify the biblical God as the God who has always existed and who intelligently made life for more reasons than just Eden, the flood, the Tower of Babel, and Sodom and Gomorrah. But really, how much evidence do you need? If someone showed me that there was a location that's now underwater, but that we can see from satellite photos actually existed because of the rivers that are described, that would get my attention. Is some other religious religion or historical reference doing that, pointing out these features of the pre-flood world in ways that would lend credibility to the God that's a part of that story? I'm not aware of any that come close to these kinds of things. The flood, Tower of Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah, those four things show evidence. The diversification of language. Language itself is amazing. To diversify it and confuse it and to spread it around the known world and to historically document that it took place in this area and for this reason, and for both the area and the reason to make sense and to be identifiable historically. If we don't stop them, there'll be nothing too great for them. We see that happening today. Let's go down there in the region of Mesopotamia and Babylon, the Tower of Babel, and confuse them. Okay, makes sense. That's where all the languages diverge from, because it's also showable that the one language was likely cuneiform based on the Fuente Magna bowl. Sodom and Gomorrah. Someone showed me a city totally destroyed by sulfur pellets that didn't look like an area that could have ever been inhabited, and then showed me the account that described exactly what happened, and I can see the evidence of it. That would get my attention. So these four things I believe you can use, and I'm going to use, certainly tomorrow, and give you some good still shots that I hope will help out. So I'm going to keep doing that. As far as books, the Proverbs translation, that will come forward. I know I kind of jumped off that topic, but until I get that done, it's hard for me to spend time on something else. I'm probably going to do some more Elihu online papers. I know everyone wants to hear more on Sharp's rule and the sharpest rule. And to me, while that's not necessary, and I'm not sure it would create the kind of impact I really want, I'm not necessarily, trying to reach Trinitarians, but I don't want to create division or controversy either. I've already said what I believe. I've already stated the sharpest rule in basic terms. I think it needs to be clarified a little bit more. So probably I will do an Elihu online paper or some special publication to just bring together everything about that, but not as a way to create division with Trinitarians. We'll talk more about the Trinity and other texts later, but that's not what we're about. I think we need to be very careful engaging others, and it needs to be worth it. It needs to be something where we're going to be able to praise Jah or help someone, or are we just disputing and arguing and wasting our time? Maybe, maybe not. We have to decide. So I'm definitely more interested in using my time to bring people together and to praise Jah. I believe we've allowed our divisions to to keep us from doing that as much as we should, more than we should have ever allowed to happen. But beyond the translation of Proverbs, now that's going to have, again, some prefatory material that gives more history of the Proverbs and other cultures. Then you'll have the Greek and Hebrew translations with I think, relevant notes. I'm not going to try to busy up the text too much. I want it to be a clear showing of both the Hebrew and Greek next to each other, the translation, and then notes that'll be helpful, notes that'll be useful, and various alternate readings. So we'll see. We'll see. That's the only publication, like book form. I'm going to do a soft cover and then a special hardcover run. There'll be an appendix, which will be an update to the... I did a blog article on Jah loves her, wisdom, his son, the word. And I've got more. I've got more parallel identifying marks between biblical and ancient literature and New Testament. When I say biblical, I mean Hebrew references. Hebrew references, ancient Jewish references, and Christian references that I'm going to include in that appendix, as an appendix with that article, and update it to show that I believe it's very clear that Jesus is the wisdom spoken of in Proverbs and the Word, who was identified as a real existing being alongside God, a spirit, like all the other sons of God. And like I'll talk about in future episodes, if to me it stops and ends with John 10, right? When Jesus was confronted with the question by the Jews, when he said, "Why are you stoning me?" He says, "We're not stoning you for a fine work, but because you claim to be a god or God." But his response tells you what their accusation was, because he didn't use a text like Isaiah 9 that might have been ambiguous in his defense of claiming to be God. He used Psalm 82, a text that refers to other sons of God against whom the word of God came, but who nonetheless could be considered gods. And so if they can be considered gods, how can the one whom God sent forth not be considered the son of God or a god? Being a son of God meant that you were a god, a divine being. Just like a son of the singer meant you were a singer. Son of the prophets meant you were a prophet. It is a Hebrew idiom. So when it refers to the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, Jesus put himself in that category when he used Psalm 82 to defend himself. So when people say, well, why do you use these other texts? You're creating a polytheistic view of Jesus. That's not true. We're using the very same method Jesus used. We're just showing that you can be a son of God too without compromising Jah's unique sovereignty and without promoting polytheism, because it's not a different God. Jesus is only the same God as the Father. He's just a different spirit who exists alongside him. I know we kind of got a little off there, but it's discussion day, right? We get to talk about things we want. And next week, and we're not necessarily done here, but since we kind of got off on Jesus a little in answering Dave's question about the Proverbs translation, I expect the translation will be out by the end of next year. So right now I'm almost finished with chapter 17, and I've finished parts of a lot of in the 20 chapters, 20 through 29, and then 30 and 31. I've finished a lot of those texts. So if I can finish credibly, I'm not rushing this. If I can finish this and do it well by next summer of 2019, it's going to take me at least 6 months to a year to edit and finalize the introduction, go through the text again. I go through it regularly, so a lot of that's being done while I'm doing it. But still, you have to go through it, double check things, triple check, especially with the translation of Jah's word, and then put the appendix together. So it may even move into 2020. But I'm doing these videos. I'm trying to do what I can to stay in contact with everybody. I will try to write more on the blog. If you haven't joined the forum, I know Dave, I think David, you had joined the forum before. If you want to join again, go ahead and register. We just have a basic introduction that, if you agree to accept, then fine. I'm trying to keep things open, but also a little bit closed so that those of us who already see that we want to do these three things. We want to do these three things more than anything else. And even though we have our beliefs and other things are important, these three we're going to put before everything else. I'm going to create a special place for those people because I want to make sure that I give my best time and energies to the people who, like me, have already reached a point where we're ready to go. We're here to praise Jah. Who needs to know? Who needs information? We've got it, right? We can talk to you about God. We can tell you about Jesus, and we can do. We can talk to you about how we treat others right. So we can keep it real simple, and help a lot of people that way. But otherwise, I am gonna try to reach out more. I'm not gonna promote these videos too much on YouTube as far as like tagging them, and I know how you can get a lot of views. But I'm going to try to get the normal amount of views by just doing the subject matter and not I will add more links to other videos and things. Like I mentioned that one Bright Insight on Atlantis. I think that's a great video. I'm going to add links to videos tomorrow, especially on Sodom and Gomorrah and on Eden and the flood and on Babel. I'm going to show you what I believe is the footprint, satellite footprint of what was the Tower of Babel. It's huge. And you'll be able to compare that with the Ziggurat of Ur. See how big it really was. So, you know, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to try to get the people who really are interested. And then we'll grow from there. And then help you guys do the same things. So you can create a group of people in your area who you can meet with, and we can do these shows together. Or you can do your groups together. And then we start praising Jah together. That's what we're going to do anyway, right? That's what Revelation 19 says. That's what everything is leading towards. And so why not start now? Why not put ourselves in a good spot now? Let's see. So separating being from person. Well, how can you do that? The only example I know of is the Siamese twin, right? So here you have an example. A Siamese twin is essentially one human being. If we're going to talk about a being as a human, a Siamese twin would represent one human being with two persons. Now you have two heads, so the question of what is a human being gets a little complicated. And obviously we can't make this a perfect analogy to something we don't even fully understand, spirit. But the Bible doesn't make that separation. Never talks like that. It just refers to the people. So it speaks in terms, in my JW Defended book, I do go through this. I do have subsections on person and being, and there may be some newer ways, but you know, the discussion is not going to change. It's not going to ever end for those who are committed to that understanding. They just cannot see the Bible calling Jesus God without him being God in the metaphysical sense that the Trinity promotes it. So, whereas again, look at what Jesus' answer was. John 10. The Pharisees, the Jews came to him and they were going to stone him. Right? And I'm going to paraphrase the account, but essentially refer to it, I think, accurately. And he said, well, why are you stoning me? What have I done? And they said, we're not stoning you for something you've done. We're stoning you because you, even though claiming to be a man, make yourself a god or God. Let's just say either or for now. Okay. So here you have Jesus. Now, in Trinitarian's view, he's the son of the Trinity. He's in the Trinitarian view of God. He's the son. He knows exactly who he is. He knows why he's there. He knows who they are. So he understands everything. He's God the Son in their view. What was his answer? His answer was, is it not written? I said, you are gods. And he's quoting Jah speaking to the other gods there. And it doesn't matter if those gods in Psalm 82 are angels or human judges. It makes no difference. Because Jesus is the one who cites the text. That's not Greg Stafford citing this text and saying, well, this is what it means. I'm just reading what Jesus does. It's not like John 10. We'll set aside the God or a God part of John 10 for now. Other than that, there's no translation problem here. There's no issue, no difficulty with the text. So Jesus clearly refers to Psalm 82 and says, if he said this, then why is it a problem if I said that? If these sons of God, against whom God's word came, can be called gods. Now notice he uses the term gods. He doesn't refer to them as persons or make a difference in order to avoid polytheism between person and being, right? I mean, this is the Son of God. Who more than God the Son would preserve the right understanding of a text that God the Son is quoting to defend his identity? He's quoting a text that refers to other beings. Beings, persons, same thing. He's not differentiating. It's a plural. Gods. As gods in a sense that he doesn't deny. And then says, if this is okay, what's wrong with me claiming to be the Son of God? So in his mind, it was the same thing as well. Claiming to be the Son of God was the same thing as what they were saying he said he was, a God. Trinitarians will say he was claiming to be God, but that makes no sense. Zero. To then quote Psalm 82 and the use of gods to explain why it's okay for you to call yourself God. Well, the Jews would have just looked at him and said, well, listen, we're not talking about the false judges or the God or whatever. We're talking about you claiming to be God. That text has nothing to do with God. That has to do with God. That would have been the easy comeback. And it would have shown that Jesus was quoting a text that didn't have anything to do with what they were accusing him of. That's not what happened. That's not what he did. He quoted the text that answered their accusation and showed that he was correct. Simple. That's it. Now, how far beyond that do you want to go? How far beyond that do you want to engage with someone who won't accept that? To me, I don't know that you can make a lot of progress with someone who's not going to accept Jesus' own defense of himself by referring to a text that says exactly what we're talking about. That sons of God can be called gods, and that even Jesus is a God in the sense that he's the Son of God. To me, it's very simple. And I don't mean to be, I understand it can be complicated. And at one time it was, because you have to go through these different questions and these different translations. But when you spend as much time as I have with them, you realize, well, wait a minute. These texts were pretty simple. And it's not like this is Plato or Aristotle I'm dealing with here. This is an account of a figure who taught in fairly plain language. Yes, there are some things that are a little bit difficult or, not as easy to understand as they were back then. But those are very few, in my opinion. And this is not one of them. The text itself answers the question that's so often asked us. Why do you guys promote? We're not promoting polytheism. We're promoting the biblical view of being a son of God. And how you can either be your own God like Satan and these other demons, or you can be Jah. You can be, like Jesus, a son of God who represents his Father, who does his Father's will, because there's no one better than Jah. There's no one else to be. And that's the choice these spirits have. Be their own self or be Jah. And what greater honor and glory could you have than Jah allowing you to act like him and be considered him because you do it exactly right. So these accounts, I think, if you look at them more carefully and you simplify it and you get beyond a lot of this discussion, you start talking person and being, you're going to have a long day, because the Bible doesn't talk that way. The Bible doesn't make those separations. And like I said, Jesus' quotation of the account in Psalm 82 is directly contradictory to any attempt to try to say that when he's called God, or when it says like in John 1:1, he was with God, that means they substitute, they take out the being word, God. That's a being, right? Even to them, one God. So he's with God, and they say, well, that's the person of the Father. Being or God becomes person of God. I've talked about this many times before. But they're just not understanding the biblical use of the term God. And I'm giving Trinitarians a pass. I'm trying to move us beyond the older discussions. I know it's a tall order, but I'm going to try. Because I think if we don't, it's going to be used against us continuously by non-Christians. And so I'm trying to simplify it for us, and I'm trying to keep us from engaging nonstop with Trinitarians that will push us out of these texts and into these discussions of person and being. They don't know what things are like in the spirit realm to the extent that they can define metaphysically a person or a being in that sense. If it's not expressed in the Bible that way, you better be very careful about claiming you understand the metaphysicality of something that's not taught that way. So what we are taught is in Hebrews chapter 1 is that Jesus is in the Son is the character of the Father's being. It uses the word for being there and says Jesus is a copy of his being. And so that obviously indicates generation. But the other thing with Trinitarians often, John 1:18 is great because that shows, so if you notice in my translation, I use a translation uniquely begotten. And that's because the term monos, it's composed of two words. I'm not defining it based on that composition, but monogenes is monos and genes. So monos can mean only, and only if there's only one of something, or if it's the only thing, it's unique, right? It has a sense of a unique quality to it, only in and of itself. So it is in fact appropriate there because we know that God has other sons. That's talked about multiple times in the Hebrew Scriptures. And we know that in Hebrews, it talks about the birth of Isaac as being Abraham's only begotten, or him being the only begotten of Abraham and Sarah. So that's also a unique generation, right? That happened because of Jah. He allowed her to become pregnant. So it was unique. It wasn't that Isaac was Abraham's only child. The generation of Isaac was unique in that Jah allowed it to occur when it otherwise would not have. So there's a uniquely begotten. Isaac was uniquely begotten. Jesus was uniquely begotten. And those terms are qualifying the term theos. So you're never going to find the Father referred to that way. Even in the later church writings, he's always the unbegotten God. So they maintain that distinction. But once you get a Trinitarian committed to person and being, every single term that refers to God, they're going to see as a person of God. And you're just going to go through this constant series of textual reinterpretations or substitutions, and you'll have to call them on the very first one, because otherwise you just jump from text to text, and they'll keep saying, well, that's in his human form, or that's from his personal self. They never talks like that. Jesus doesn't say, he refers to himself always as his whole person. So when they want to read into it a separation of persons, they're really saying that Jesus is two persons. That's the only logical conclusion you could draw, because on the one hand, he says, I don't know everything. Only the Father knows some things. But on the other hand, they say he maintained his divinity, and so therefore would have to have maintained his omniscience. See, for us, that's completely consistent with Philippians 2, right? He emptied himself of the divine form. He did have, the term harpagmon can have a quality of seizing because of the verb harpazo, but really harpagmon it's a noun. And so it refers to something, and then the verbal aspects of harpazo get involved. So something, the NWT says, didn't consider a seizure, namely that he should be equal to God, a seizure. Or as in my translation, I believe I put it as something to exploit. So I do that because I believe that it's talking about the equality that Jesus had with the Father as a divine being, as a spirit. So he was in the same form as God. In the same way, I'm in the form of a man. William's in the form of a man. David's in the form of a man. We're equal in that way. We're flesh. We're not exactly equal. We have differences and features, and we have different knowledge. But as far as equality of being, we're equal. We're exactly the same in terms of our composition, flesh. So when it talks about spirits being equal, remember also it talks about when Jesus said that those who are resurrected, the Pharisees tried to trap him, and they said, well, whose wife would she be? She had several wives, and then she died. Well, remember Jesus said, well, she doesn't belong to any of them, because those who are resurrected from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are equal to angels. So That doesn't mean that they're equal in every way, and certainly not equal in their age, right? And no human's equal to an angel in age unless an angel was recently created after we were. We wouldn't know that. But assuming they haven't been created since we've been made, just for our discussion, then we know that that's dealing with a specific equality. The fact that they don't marry like the angels once they've been resurrected. Whether that means they're going to be in a spirit form or not doesn't make it, we'll find out. But they're equal in that respect. And so that answered the question. And so when it talks about Jesus having an equality, it's the same thing as in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. So he's on an equal plane. He's with him in the heavenly realm as a divine being, a spirit, his son. Same with the other sons, but he's the only begotten, the firstborn, right? These are all terms that are used that convey something very specific and unique about Jesus. And we're told right in Deuteronomy 21:17, that the firstborn is the beginning of one's generative power. Okay? Jesus hasn't been appointed firstborn, and there's someone else that's Jah's firstborn, and we just don't know who it is. The firstborn is a prominent figure, and that's why it's Jesus. He's the one doing all these things because he's unique, and he's firstborn. So there is an equality, but he gave that up rather than exploit it. This goes back to what I was saying. So versus calling it a seizure or an act of seizing, like trying to take something that's not yours, which is possible, it seems more like to me that having that equality existing as a divine spirit, he gave it up. He didn't consider it something to exploit. So if you were in a divine form, like Satan, spirits, evil spirits that are in a powerful form, likely have authority to some extent, they can exploit that. We can exploit our human authority and form. Well, they can do it too. But Jesus didn't. Instead, he lowered himself. Again, now think of the pre-flood days. What did the sons of God do? They tried to elevate themselves by coming down and establishing kingdoms on this earth with the daughters of men. What did Jesus do? He lowered himself, didn't accept any kingdom, didn't even accept a wife, and focused solely on Jah, like all those other sons of God should have done as well. So whereas they were punished, Jesus was glorified because he was a good son. He did the right things, and he's still doing the right things in our view. But, the Trinity, try to understand. I know we get into this and it can be so easy to maybe move on into it further, but if they're believing in Jesus and they're confessing him and they're not making trouble for you, you might consider leaving them be. You might not help them as much as you think you can. And if you've already shown them things like John 10, you always want to try to help a person who may be misled. But if they're still believing in Jesus and they use the Trinity because they think it helps them with monotheism, sometimes you have to cut your losses, or at least not always think you have to save the day all the time, and let them be. Let them be and know that at least they're expressing faith in God's Son. They may not have the right framework in which to do it, and maybe they'll get there someday. Focus on the non-Christians. Focus on the people who are not yet familiar or don't know the evidence, like what we were talking about. Stuff like the satellite photos of the 4 rivers that are mentioned in Genesis, or evidence of the flood, or evidence of the diversification of languages in the region of Mesopotamia and the Tower of Babel footprint that I'll show tomorrow. Sodom and Gomorrah. This is hard evidence. This and a lot of other things that, I only mentioned 4 from Genesis. There's all kinds of stuff that I could use and highlight. Yeah, it's true, William. So the contrast between Jesus and those other gods, the other sons of God, and he did it himself. The account we were talking about, John 10, I believe that in Psalm 82, those are spirit sons of God that he's talking about, and that Jesus made the contrast himself. He said, look, he's calling even these people against whom my Father's word came, gods. So there shouldn't be a problem with me being considered as such, since I'm coming in the Father's name and have been sent by him. Complete contrast, absolutely justified the position he was claiming, and showed that they just didn't understand the biblical terminology, and nor, even if they did, it doesn't seem to me that they would apply it to him fairly. So in either case, Jesus' answer stands. I don't really have anything to add to it. I mean, there are other texts that have become important and relevant and controversial. I think it starts and ends with John 10 for me, because anyone who wants to question my view of gods, monotheism, and texts that use gods or God, I can't think of a better person to answer it than Jesus himself. So I defer to Jesus, and I'm not doing that in a way that I think is just taking it light. I think that account is so powerful, and I write about it. I deal with James White on that level. With John 10, I don't think he ever effectively addressed that, nor I don't think they can. Well, what can you say? They're going to be you make them argue with Jesus rather than argue with a Trinitarian who doesn't want to see your position or leave you be. Let them argue with Jesus. Tell them to explain to you why Jesus cites Psalm 82 to defend himself. And then they'll say something like, well, that text doesn't refer to, that's talking about human judges. Well, that's not my point. Why is Jesus citing that text to defend himself? Don't get off that. No matter what they say, until you hear the answer, Jesus is citing this text to defend himself because, until those words or their equivalent come out of the other person's mouth, do not leave the discussion to another topic. You stay right there, because until they understand that's what he's doing, they're gonna default to this alternate view of who the gods are in Psalm 82, and not understand that's not the point. In fact, if they identify those gods as human judges, it even makes Jesus somewhat of a lesser person, I would say, or at least he's saying you can, if even these lower than angel human judges can be called gods, it still is a good argument, but it elevates him more if those beings in that text are actual spirit gods, because then he's saying, well, look, I'm the Son of God, those are sons of God, God's word came against them, it's not coming against me, so what's your problem? Try to simplify it like that. It's the best way to deal with them, because otherwise they're gonna get you into these realms of metaphysical speculation. You're going to find yourself speculating with someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, because who knows anything about spirit and what happens relationally there? We only know what the text says and what it doesn't. And it's all on our side. They have a few texts that can kind of support what they're saying on some level, but they don't fit with the other ones, right? All of ours fit. They fit together perfectly. And the only problem we've ever had is this charge of polytheism, because it's not hard to establish that there are other gods, or that Jesus is called a God in comparison to the Father without being a rival. But when you have Jesus himself using a text that bears on all these things in response to people who are charging him with claiming to be the very thing that either we or Trinitarians say he was, there's not a better text. Memorize that text. Go through John 10 and be as familiar with it as you can. Look at what I wrote about it as well, if that'll help you. Rewatch this video on it. I'm going to segment some of these videos, especially the Saturday show where there are multiple topics, so that I'll send out smaller sections or segments of this video and then just be dealing with that. So I'll probably break it up and send out a video later that just deals with my discussion on John 10 today. And then maybe another video on one of the other subjects, and then the whole video. So, but I'll make sure it's relevant if I do that, and useful, so that you'll have something that then, apart from this whole discussion, if you just want to show someone a discussion on the John 10 part, you can just send them that part of the video, unless you know how to trim them yourself. So I'm looking over your comments. I like being able to see it now. Unfortunately, this is the first time I've really been able to see the comments scrolling through. So I'm happy now I have things set up right. That means on our day text in the morning, if you've got something to say, go ahead and say it. I'll try to interact with it. But this should make things really good going forward. So very, very nice. And I will include as much as I can in future broadcasts. Now, we've been going for, I guess, about an hour. So what I'll do is I'm going to close it off there. And this show, We're gonna set it up and broadcast it, but I will trim it so that the first part, before we officially started the show, won't be on the published video, and then we'll keep it nice and tight. And then tomorrow I'm going to highlight further these 4 things that I tried to deal with primarily today. Evidences of Jah. So we don't look at the Bible to prove Jah. We look at life to prove life exists. Life's always existed, and life is obviously intelligent. Then, when we look at history, one God stands out above all others in terms of his interaction and credible relation of events and locations like Sodom, Gomorrah, Eden, Babel, or just the flood world in general, some of the evidence we have of where some of these cities were located that are now underwater. That's hard evidence. To me, that's evidence you can use to establish the credibility of the texts which teach us about Jah and the things that occurred in the pre-flood world and since then. So that's what we're going to do tomorrow. I'll highlight that. I'll include some still shots. I'll try to give you guys the best images of the information I'm talking about that I can in that show. And then next week, so the first CWJah Talk show was 3 things. Let me get my 3 fingers in there. And then the second show this week is on Jah, the first thing. So then tomorrow we're going to do the great message on Jah. The Saturday show and Sunday shows, I'm trying to use them to complement each other and to be in tandem. And then next week we'll go on to Jesus. So a lot of these questions today on some of the Jesus questions, next week's going to be great for that. And I'm going to get into more stuff about Jesus, his relationship with Jah, and I'm looking forward to that show. More on the firstborn and a lot of other important information. And then we'll go on to how we can treat others the way we want to be treated. I'll talk more about Confucius and his principle, other related ethical principles in life, and then open it up to everybody else as best I can. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate the time we have together. It's starting to mean more and more to me because, like you, for a long time, I didn't have a whole lot of people, but I knew there were. And I knew that even if there were just a few, that this is the right thing to do. So I'm going to keep doing it. I'm not going to stop. And if we can find others to join us in doing this, we'll just keep going all the way into the coming age. Praise Jah.